I work with many different leaders. I've had the privilege of spending 30 years in this space, worked with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of leaders, depending on how you want to count leadership. And I've worked with CEOs of major multinational corporations. I've worked with leaders in the military of special forces units, as well as general units. I've worked with entrepreneurs who are leading small to very large companies. I understand something about how leaders perceive themselves and how they experience the world. And what I've found is that I have a definition I like to use, or a concept rather, that I like to use about leadership. What I like to say is that good leaders help people to achieve their full potential. They help them to realize everything they're capable of realizing. Great leaders help people to exceed their potential, because what they do is they allow individuals to tap into the collaborative. They allow individuals to tap into something that they themselves actually can't attain on their own, but they can attain alongside others. And it may just be the one-to-one between the leader and the individual that's being led, so to speak, where that dynamic creates something which is greater than either of them possess. Now take that and extend it to a group of 15 or 20 or 200 or 2,000 or 20,000, and the potential becomes greatly exaggerated. It becomes an enormous potential to tap into when we get into this idea of leaders being able to take people beyond their innate potential, to become more than they're capable of being on their own. But to do that, they have to acknowledge the reality of the situations they're facing. Now, in this exploration with leaders that I've had this privilege to be working with, what I find is that some of them, most of them in fact, avoid fear, or they discount it, or they don't acknowledge it, and they simply move back from it. They don't want to know that fear is present. And especially when they're in front of the troops, so to speak, right? They want to talk about how we're going to get along. It's going to be great. We're going to be a huge success. Nothing can stop us. The world for us is, an open, system that we can do anything we want with, and all that kind of garbage. The reality is that many of these people are experiencing deep-seated fear because they know things to be true that they're not speaking to. This is a problem. This is an issue if it's not confronted and dealt with. Now, on the other hand, great leaders I've worked with acknowledge fear. They walk in front of people and they say, there are unknowns here. There are things that we know, and there are things we simply don't know. And the things that we don't know can always present to us challenges that we at some point need to deal with and must be present to as they arise. And what they get is a magical thing. I like to say this to the clients I work with. You cannot know what you don't know until you know it. And that's so important to me. I just want to repeat that statement. You cannot know what you don't know until you know it. And yet, 99% of the clients I work with, the people I coach, the people I consult with, all want a sense of certainty about a future that doesn't yet exist. They literally want to know what they can't know before they know it, because it doesn't exist yet. And in fact, they're co-conspirators into bringing whatever it is that's going to exist into being. But they're only co-conspirators. They don't control the universe. I haven't yet met Vishnu. So until I do, I recognize that other people get a vote. The system gets a vote. And because there's an unknown, the way our neural systems are organized, the way our nervous systems are organized, is fear can emerge as a result of what's unknown. It's just that simple. It doesn't have to be something terrible or bad or horrible that exists. It's that we don't know what's going to happen next that creates a level of fear that we have to become aware of. Now, I learned a lot about this as a martial artist. I learned a lot about this as I said, a street rat fighting in the streets, as well as in organized systems of fighting. And I was a competitive boxer for a while, and I've been studying different forms of martial arts at different times with different people who are phenomenal at what they do. And what I find is they're able to collapse what they experience as a sense of fear into a force of motivation. They use it. They don't let it use them. Now, to get this, you have to begin to think about, what does it actually mean to be afraid? What does it mean to have the sensation of fear? And what does it do? And how does it work within us? So one of the things that typically happens is, as we trigger that sympathetic response, we begin to experience a certain kind of physiological change as well. And again, you may know this, you may have heard about it, you will hear about it if you listen to a number of the conference sessions. And it's got to do with the fact that our breathing can become shallow and tight. The muscles of the thorax, the body process here, contract and shrink and become tight. And it can be hard to breathe. And this sets up an anxiety loop for many people where because they can't breathe, they feel like they're dying. They feel like the world is closing in on them. And it's horrifying. So they breathe even less. Now it's, and eventually the advantage is don't worry about that. Even if it's happening to you, you'll just pass out. And when you're unconscious, there's no anxiety. And since there's no anxiety, you'll just start breathing. So not a whole lot to worry about there. But in the moment that it's happening, I get it's terrifying. I get that it may be hard to control. And there's some mechanism we can use. The standard thing, you can all play with this now if you want. And you'll see you're going to get a change in the second factor that I like to talk about when I'm referring to the sympathetic system, which is a change in heart rate and a change in blood pressure. And one of the things that almost all people who have been in emergency training, whether they're special forces units or they're EMTs or any of that, they learn to do what's called a 4-4 breathing, where it's a 4 count in, breathing in, 1, 4, hold, 4, out, 4. And that 4-4 breathing actually changes your heart rate. Now, I'll give you something that's a little bit interesting. When we look at what we can call primitive cultures, cultures that have not been saturated with civilization as we understand it, and we look at their breathing rates, it becomes really interesting. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to take 15 seconds. I'm actually going to put it on my little watch here, and I'm going to count. I'd just like you to count your breaths with me. Whatever number of breaths you have, just breathe normally. Don't do anything fancy. Don't go into your deep tantric meditation states or any of that BS that I know is popular around these environments of embodiment conferences. Just normal. Be a normal human being for 5 seconds and breathe, all right? And I'll count to 15. I'll use my watch. I actually have a little chronograph watch here. I'm going to use it. And when I say start, just count your breaths. Okay, go ahead. Start now. That's about halfway. Just keep counting. And that's 15 seconds now. So whatever number of breaths you have. If you wouldn't mind, just in the chat, or you can speak out loud if you want, and just tell me how many breaths did you have? 4, 2.5, 3, 2, 4, 5, 3, 2. So if I add up the averages here, 2.5 would give us about 10 breaths in a minute. 6 looks like the high number right now. There's a number of people at 6. So 6 breaths would give us 24 breaths in a minute, 4 times, right? 15 seconds. So here's the thing that's really interesting. When we look at these primitive cultures, their average intake of breath is about 4 per minute at rest. 4. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to time it again. I'm going to give you a count to breathe in and breathe out, not at 4. 4 is too much for most people, but at 8 breaths a minute. So I'll give you a count. So go ahead and start again when I say breathing in now. Hold it, go ahead and breathe out, and breathe in again now, and hold it if you can, and breathe out now, and that's 15 seconds and 2 breaths. So that's 8 breaths a minute. That's twice as much breathing, so to speak, as these quote unquote primitive people seem to need to keep themselves alive and healthy. And what does it mean? It means a whole lot of things. It means, number one, they're probably highly oxygenated from the breathing they do, because they probably use the entire lobe structure of the lungs. They breathe all the way in. They don't breathe in clavicle breaths. They don't breathe just in terms of thoracic breath or rib cage breathing. And they don't just breathe diaphragmatically, because they're not opera singers trying to, get way down the diaphragm only. They use the entire thing. So they breathe into the diaphragm, through the thorax, and up into the clavicle. And that takes time, but also oxygenates the system. This lowers the heart rate. And a magical thing begins to occur. It raises the threshold position of the access to the somatic response to the sympathetic system. So in other words, it's harder to get to that anxiety response when all of these systems are optimized. And you've probably heard a lot about breath if you've been around an embodiment community, whether it's a yoga community or martial arts community or some kind of physical training or whatever it might be. If it's embodied, Embodiment people like to talk about breathing, and there's a great reason to talk about breathing, but you've probably heard about it if you've been in this space at all. What's interesting is the correlation between breathing and so much else, and the way it alters our mind. And one of the things that's happening when we get into this fear response that we can notice is that our breathing begins to change. We breathe more shallowly, and we breathe more quickly. And despite the fact that we're breathing more quickly, we're less oxygenated. And that means, in addition to everything else that might be true, our brains aren't going to work as well. So one of the critical distinctions of fear is that it shuts down our ability to be creative. It shuts down our ability to think through what we're confronting. And we wind up with just two choices as it escalates. And that is either to attack and kill whatever it is. I got to kill it, got to make it go away, got to mend it right now, got to kill it, got to kill it, got to kill it. And we see this in some of the frantic conversation that's happening even in the social sphere. How all these people who are against us in terms of ideology, they simply hold a different ideology than we do. They're simply using words that we don't like to hear or don't agree with, or the way they're using the words, or the things they're talking about, or the way they're referring to other people. We don't like it. We got to kill them. At least as an idea. So while we might not be violent physically, we're being violent socially. And many times what's happening is that violence leads to an emotional coercion, where what we're doing is we're behaving violently towards other people emotionally and compromising and co-opting the emotions that are negatively inhibiting to the system. On the other hand, we can open this up, and when we do have access to creative thinking, our minds are what we call in an excitatory state. And it doesn't mean we're excited. It means that we have the ability to get the neurons to connect and link in ways that are unfamiliar to us. We're willing to expose ourselves to the unknown. And if everything I'm going to say here, if you got just this one idea, then I would be pleased with our time together. That the distinction between the inhibitory and the excitatory states of consciousness are that in the inhibitory, you simply cannot think beyond the immediacy of whatever's present for you in the moment. And it takes over your mind, it controls your responses, and you have no choices in your decisions. You will fall back to the patterns that are most familiar and comfortable to you, even when they don't work. You'll find yourself in loops of failed performance, because there's no choice. When your mind is in the excitatory, however, creativity becomes present. And creativity means that you can think beyond the present moment. You can think into a space that doesn't yet exist. And it may never exist because you may come up with 50 or 100 or 1,000 different spaces, of which only one you'll choose to manifest in this next moment. And that manifestation of that creative act creates a possibility that wasn't present before you manifested it. You see, when you're in the inhibitory, the things that you're doing have already happened because you're familiar with them. You know what's going to happen, and that's why you do it, because it's comfortable and it's safe. So in a way, what I'm suggesting to you is that this evolutionary process of fear is designed primarily to keep you safe. And until you acknowledge and respect it, you won't be able to figure out what you really need to be safe from and what's a real threat. And if we don't recognize the distinction between real threats and false threats, we're going to be ending up in this inhibitory posture where we cannot think, where we have no choice, where we're making bad and false decisions in an ongoing way. And yes, the breath has something to do with it, right? So we want to really be clear about how do we get into an excitatory state? What does that mean? Yeah, it's definitely helpful to note what kicks us into faster breathing, because that's going to be one of the triggers that kicks you into, quote unquote, kicks you into this fear response that we're going to talk about, and not to try to avoid it. This is really an important point I'm trying to make here, is do not try to avoid the fear response. You want to be able to recognize that it's a signal to alert you to what the heck is going on in the environment, right? Ignoring the fear response is how people walk down the street, get a sensation or an intuition about something, and then get hit in the back of the head because they didn't pay attention to it, when they simply could have turned around and looked at who was behind them, right? So I said I spent a lot of time around the martial arts. The best, most powerful skill you can develop as a martial artist is probably situational awareness. To not be where the danger is way more useful than having the best martial arts skill on the planet. If somebody's not around to hit you, you don't have to have any particular skills to not get hit or to hit them back, right? So situational awareness, huge if you want to be, in the world in a way that you're comfortable and safe, whether that's from other people or situational, emergent things that are going on around you, know where the exits are, something simple like that, right? And avoid situations that are likely to be aggravating. So that's why it's important to pay attention to those signals, like your increased breathing rate. Jump back into this other side of the conversation. I've been trying to explain why I think fear is so powerful and useful to us, because it does alert us to the situation that we're in. We want to begin to notice these kind of tickling responses in our body. Hey, something's going on, right? Like there's something going on, and I know it and I feel it, even though I don't yet know what it is, even though I can't pinpoint this or that. I don't want to shut down that experience and go, oh, it must be nothing because I looked around, I can't see anything. There's nobody here. I don't hear anything that's bothering me. And I'm having a good day and I ate well and I slept 8 hours or whatever. Trust those instinctive sensations that trickle up through the body and titillate you into a higher level of awareness.